I had spent 40 years building my career, long hours, sleepless nights, and endless sacrifices. Finally, it was time to retire. No more stress, no more work. Just peace, relaxation, and the savings I had carefully built up for this moment. My company threw me a beautiful retirement party, and I was surrounded by old friends, colleagues, and family. Laughter filled the banquet hall, drinks were flowing, and for once I felt like I could truly breathe. It was supposed to be a perfect night. Then my younger brother Mark stood up. With that same smug grin he always had, he raised his glass and said, "Well, since you won't need your savings anymore, I think it's only fair that you give them to me." At first people laughed. A few even clapped, thinking he was making a harmless joke. I forced a polite smile, taking a sip of my drink. But then he pulled out a stack of papers. "I figured we'd make it official," he continued, waving the documents in the air. "So I went ahead and drafted this will for you. Saves you the trouble, you know. Just sign here." The laughter died instantly. I frowned. The entire room shifted. People glancing at one another, some whispering. Was he serious? Surely he was joking, right? But no. He placed the papers on the table in front of me, a pen right beside them. His grin widened. "Come on, you trust your own brother, don't you?" I picked up the papers, flipping through them. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a joke. It was a real document. A will. And in it, he had named himself the sole inheritor of everything I had worked for. My pension, my house, my life savings, all of it would legally belong to him. Then I saw something even worse. At the bottom of the document, in shaky, uneven handwriting, was my forged signature. Mark had tried to scam me. At my own retirement party. In front of everyone. The audacity. I felt my hands tighten around the papers, my jaw clenching. I looked up at Mark, who was still grinning, acting like he had already won. That's when my lawyer James stood up from his seat. Now, Mark had no idea that I had already drafted my real will. And he certainly didn't know that I had updated it just a month before. James cleared his throat, adjusting his tie as he stepped forward. "Actually," he said, reaching into his briefcase, "let me show you the real one." Mark's grin vanished instantly. The entire room went silent. James placed a real, notarized, legally binding will on the table. Mark's face drained of color. His hands trembled as he clutched his fake documents to his chest. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms. Checkmate. But that was just the beginning. Because that night, Mark wasn't just about to be humiliated. He was about to be completely destroyed. Mark had always been the problem child, the golden boy in our parents' eyes, but a walking disaster in reality. He was the youngest of us, spoiled from birth, never had to work for anything, and somehow always found a way to get exactly what he wanted. While I spent my teenage years working part-time jobs to help with bills and put myself through college, Mark was out partying. While I worked long hours to climb the corporate ladder, Mark bounced from one failed business idea to another, always relying on handouts. When our parents passed away, I handled everything, the funeral costs, settling the estate, clearing their debts. And what did Mark do? He grabbed whatever valuables he could find, our dad's vintage watch, our mother's jewelry, the family car. But I let it go because, at the time, I thought, he's my brother and I don't need to fight him over this. Looking back, I should have known better. Mark never worked for anything in his life. He borrowed money from family and friends and never paid them back. He always had the latest phone, the newest gadgets, but somehow was always struggling. He had a long history of conveniently forgetting debts and guilt-tripping people into bailing him out. And whenever someone called him out, he played the victim. So when he stood up at my retirement party, smirking like he had already won, I should have known he wasn't just joking. The sheer audacity of it. He tried to fake a will. In front of everyone. And he actually expected me to sign it. As I flipped through the pages, my blood boiled. It was so sloppy yet so bold. He had filled out everything, my pension, my house, my savings, all to him. And at the very bottom, a forged signature. It wasn't even a good forgery. The strokes were shaky, uneven, clearly rushed. He must have been planning this for weeks. I glanced at him. Still grinning. That's when James, my lawyer, stepped in. "Actually," James said, pulling out a folder from his briefcase. Let me show you the real one. Mark froze. His face drained of color. The room went silent. James laid the real, legally binding will on the table. The difference was night and day. Properly notarized, dated, and signed. And in it, not a single cent for Mark. I saw panic flicker in his eyes. His hands started shaking. What does it say? He stammered. James smiled. It says, he said smoothly, that you get nothing. The entire room shifted. Some people gasped. Others just stared at Mark, waiting for his reaction. I leaned forward, looking my brother dead in the eyes. You really thought you could scam me? I asked, my voice calm. At my own retirement party? Mark's panic turned to anger. His lips curled and he let out a bitter laugh. You think this is funny? He snapped. You don't even need the money. You're retired. You're sitting on a pile of cash while I struggle. You should be taking care of me. The entitlement in his voice was staggering. I clenched my jaw. Taking care of you? Mark, I've spent my entire life working for what I have. You could have done the same. Mark scoffed. You had it easy. Mom and Dad bailed you out every time you messed up. That's when James spoke up again. Actually, he said, flipping through another file, let's talk about that. Mark stiffened. What are you talking about? James pulled out another set of documents and placed them on the table. Do you recognize these? He asked. Mark stepped closer, squinting at the papers. His face went from angry to pale. That's nothing, he muttered. James nodded. Really? Because these show large sums of money taken from your parents' estate after they passed. Money that was supposed to be split evenly between you and your brother. A few people in the crowd gasped. Others started murmuring. My relatives, who had been silent before, were now whispering to each other, their expressions shifting from confusion to realization. Mark's eyes darted around the room. He was looking for an escape. You stole from your own family? My cousin David finally spoke up. Are you serious? Mark shook his head frantically. No, this is a mistake. I don't know where he got that from. James sighed. We got it from the bank, Mark. Your name is all over the withdrawals. Silence. I felt sick. I had always wondered why there wasn't much left in our parents' accounts when I settled their estate. I assumed medical bills, funeral expenses, debts. But no, it was Mark. He had been stealing from them for years. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay calm. Mark, I said, my voice steady. Is this true? Mark licked his lips, his hands trembling. I didn't steal it, okay? That money was mine too. James shook his head. Not all of it. And the law doesn't agree with you. Mark's breathing grew heavy. His eyes darted toward the exit. Then James reached into his briefcase one last time. He pulled out a letter. This, he said, placing it on the table, was found when we looked into your parents' financial records. I picked it up. My hands shook as I unfolded it. It was a letter from my mother. Handwritten. Dated just weeks before she passed. I started reading. If you're reading this, then the truth has come out. I didn't know how to tell you while I was alive, but you deserve to know. Mark has been taking money behind your back. We didn't want to believe it at first, but the bank confirmed it. We hoped he would stop. He never did. Tears burned at the edges of my eyes. I looked up at Mark, who was now completely frozen. He knew about this letter. That's why he was so desperate. That's why he had tried to fake a will. He knew the truth would eventually come out, and he had been trying to secure my assets before it did. The room was dead quiet. Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. For the first time in his life, he had nothing to say. Mark's face was frozen in shock, his hands trembling as he clutched the fake will to his chest like it could somehow save him. The whole room was watching, family, friends, former colleagues. Everyone had just heard the truth. My brother, who had spent years playing the victim, had been caught red-handed. But instead of backing down, he doubled down. This is all lies, he sputtered, his voice shaky. You're trying to turn everyone against me. I'm your brother. You think I don't deserve anything? I stared at him, my fists clenching under the table. Mark, you didn't just try to steal from me tonight. You stole from mom and dad. And now that everyone knows, you want to act like you're the victim. Mark's expression twisted in rage. I needed that money, he shouted. I was struggling. What was I supposed to do, huh? Just sit around and watch you live your fancy life while I had nothing? I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice calm. You were supposed to get a job, Mark. Like the rest of us. A few people chuckled under their breath. Mark whipped around, glaring at them. Oh, you think this is funny? He spat. You all think you're so much better than me, don't you? My cousin David, who had been silent up until now, shook his head. No, Mark, he said, his voice firm. We think you're a thief. Mark's face went red, his eyes darting between me and James. He was desperate now, scrambling for a way out. Then James, my lawyer, delivered the final blow. Actually, James said, pulling out another folder, there's something else we need to talk about. Mark visibly stiffened. What now? He snapped. James slid another set of documents across the table. These are bank records, he said. But not just any bank records. These show fraudulent loans taken out in your parents' names, loans that were never paid back. A murmur spread through the crowd. I felt my stomach drop. I had already been blindsided by what I learned tonight, but this was something else. Mark shook his head rapidly. No. That's not true. I never did anything like that. James adjusted his glasses. Mark, these documents were flagged by the bank. Multiple loans, all taken out under your parents' names, all signed by you. You used their social security numbers, their credit history, their accounts. A gasp rippled through the room. I turned to Mark, my voice eerily calm. They died thinking they were broke, didn't they? Mark's mouth opened and closed. His whole body tensed. I stepped forward. They thought they had nothing left. That's why Dad didn't replace his old car, why Mom didn't take that vacation she always wanted. They thought their savings were gone. But the truth is you drained them dry. Mark's face went pale. His hands gripped the edge of the table, like he was about to pass out. No, he croaked. That's not fair. James sighed. What's not fair is that you left your own parents in debt while you lived off their money. And now, the bank is pressing charges. Mark's breath hitched. His eyes darted toward the exit. Then he did the dumbest thing possible. He ran. Full sprint. He bolted toward the door, shoving past guests, knocking over chairs. Someone yelped as a drink spilled. Silverware clattered to the floor. But he didn't make it far. Two uniformed officers stepped through the entrance just as Mark lunged toward the exit. A sharp, commanding voice cut through the chaos. Mark Benson. Mark skidded to a stop. His eyes widened in terror. One of the officers held up a warrant. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of financial fraud, identity theft, and forgery. Mark's entire body tensed. No, he whispered. The second officer moved in fast. 2 quick steps and they had him in cuffs. No. Mark thrashed, but there was nothing he could do. You can't do this, he screamed. He's my brother. He set me up. This is his fault. I crossed my arms and stared him down. Actually, I said coolly, this is all you. As they dragged him out of the banquet hall, his screams echoed behind him. I'm your family. You can't do this to me. I didn't answer. I just stood there, watching as my biggest burden was finally taken away. For the first time in years, I felt free. As the doors slammed shut behind Mark, a heavy silence settled over the banquet hall. For a moment, no one moved. The weight of everything that had just unfolded hung in the air like a thick fog. Then, out of nowhere, my cousin David raised his glass and said, "Well, that was the best retirement party. Entertainment I've ever seen." The room erupted in laughter. Someone even started clapping. People turned to me, shaking their heads, muttering, "Unbelievable, and you dodged a bullet." A few even ordered another round of drinks, to celebrate Mark's early retirement from freedom. I exhaled, finally letting myself relax. But I wasn't done yet. Mark thought his nightmare ended with his arrest. He was wrong. The next day, James and I got to work. See, the fraud investigation wasn't just about my parents' estate. Mark had scammed a lot of people. Old friends he had borrowed money from and never paid back. Ex-girlfriends he had convinced to co-sign loans. Landlords he had conned by faking bank statements. Now that he was officially exposed, they all came forward. Over the next few months, more cases were filed against him. More fraud charges. More civil lawsuits. Even the IRS got involved when they discovered he hadn't paid taxes in years. One by one, Mark's world crumbled. His bank accounts were frozen. His car was repossessed. His credit cards were shut down. Any money he had hidden away was seized to pay back debts. And just when he thought things couldn't get worse, they did. Because of his fake will stunt, James helped me file a separate lawsuit for attempted fraud and forgery. Since he had tried to legally steal from me, I had every right to pursue damages. And I did. Mark fought hard, but the evidence was undeniable. His forged documents, his fake will, his fraudulent loans, it was all there. And in court he looked worse than ever. The same brother who had once smirked, acting like he was untouchable, now sat slumped in his chair, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling. I won. The court ordered Mark to pay me a ridiculous amount of money. For damages. For legal fees. For emotional distress. Of course he didn't have the money. But that wasn't my problem. They garnished what little he had left. And with that, Mark was left completely broke. No house. No car. No credit. And no way to scam his way out of trouble this time. Mark tried everything to avoid jail time. He begged for a plea deal. He claimed he was innocent. But with the overwhelming evidence stacked against him, the judge wasn't feeling generous. In the end, Mark was sentenced to 7 years in prison. I was there when they took him away. He turned to me, his face pale, his voice shaking. Please, he whimpered. Please don't let them do this. We're family. I just stared at him. You stopped being family, I said, my voice steady, the moment you stole from Mom and Dad. And with that, they led him away. After Mark was locked up, life got a whole lot better. For the first time in years, I could finally breathe. No more phone calls begging for money. No more fake apologies. No more stress. I enjoyed my retirement without the constant weight of Mark's schemes hanging over me. With James' help, I was able to recover some of my parents' stolen money. Not all of it, but enough to restore some dignity to their legacy. And the best part? Mark never recovered. Even after he got out years later, he had nothing. No money. No friends. No home. No one willing to give him another chance. His name was ruined. His record made sure he couldn't get a decent job. Last I heard, he was couch surfing, bouncing between acquaintances' places, still bitter, still blaming everyone but himself. But that wasn't my problem anymore. Because while Mark was struggling to pick up the pieces of his self-destroyed life, I was enjoying mine. Retired. Debt-free. Surrounded by people who actually cared about me. And completely free of him. The best revenge? Living well. And that's exactly what I did. The dust hadn't even settled from Mark's humiliating arrest when the real consequences started rolling in. See, most people would take a fraud charge and a courtroom embarrassment as a wake-up call. Not Mark. He was still convinced he could talk his way out of it. And for a brief moment he almost did. From the county jail he started making calls. To old friends, distant relatives, anyone who might be willing to listen to his sob story. It's all a misunderstanding, he pleaded. My brother set me up. He spun the same tired narrative he had always used. The victim, the misunderstood sibling who had been unfairly cast aside. But this time no one was buying it. The family had seen too much. The forged will. The stolen inheritance. The fraudulent loans. It was all too much to ignore. Even the few relatives who had once defended him were silent now. No one offered to bail him out. No one took his calls. He was on his own. But Mark wasn't done scheming. If he couldn't manipulate the family, he'd try a different route, the legal one. And that's when things got interesting. A week after his arrest, my lawyer, James, called me. You're not going to believe this, he said, barely hiding his amusement. Mark just filed a motion to challenge your lawsuit. I nearly laughed. On what grounds? Defamation, James replied. He's claiming that you ruined his reputation. I almost dropped my coffee. Mark, The same man who had tried to rob me blind. The same man who had forged a legal document to steal my assets. The same man who had drained our parents' accounts. And now he was claiming I was the problem? James sighed. Honestly, I wouldn't even take it seriously. It's desperate and the court will likely throw it out. But I wanted you to know. I leaned back, shaking my head. Let him try. And try he did. The court scheduled a hearing, and when Mark showed up, he was a mess. Disheveled. Sleep-deprived. The smug arrogance he once had was gone. He looked smaller, like a man who had finally realized he wasn't as clever as he thought. But he still had the audacity to sit there and argue that I had ruined his life. The judge wasn't having any of it. This court finds no merit in your claims, Mr. Benson, the judge said, barely even looking at him. Your actions, not your brother's, are the reason you're here today. Motion denied. Just like that, Mark's last desperate attempt to escape accountability crumbled before his eyes. And as he was escorted back into custody, I watched the reality finally settle in. For the first time in his life, Mark had run out of people to blame. But I wasn't finished yet. Not even close. Mark had always believed he was untouchable. No matter how many times he burned bridges, no matter how many lies he told, he always found a way to land on his feet. But this time there was no soft landing. He had run out of lifelines. After the judge denied his ridiculous defamation claim, things moved quickly. The fraud investigation was already underway, and the evidence against him was overwhelming. James had been working behind the scenes, gathering more dirt, and what he found made Mark's situation even worse. See, Mark wasn't just stealing from family. He had been scamming for years. Old friends, former landlords, even past employers. When James started digging, the cases started piling up. Turns out, Mark had a long history of taking out loans, skipping rent payments, and making promises he never intended to keep. And once the news of his arrest got out, the people he had wronged came forward, one after another. James called me one evening with an update. We're up to 9 fraud claims against him now, he said, sounding almost impressed. The DA is considering pressing additional charges. I sat back, exhaling slowly. How much time is he looking at? James was quiet for a moment. If everything sticks? 10, maybe 15 years. I closed my eyes. 10 to 15 years. A decade or more behind bars. Mark was finally facing real consequences. But the best part? I wasn't done with him yet. I had one last move to play, the final nail in his coffin. Even though Mark was facing criminal charges, I still had unfinished business with him. See, it wasn't enough that he was going to prison. He had spent years taking from me, from our parents, from anyone who made the mistake of trusting him. And I wanted it all back. James and I filed a civil lawsuit against him for damages. Every cent he stole. Every fraudulent act. Every piece of my parents' estate he had drained. Of course, Mark had nothing left. His accounts were frozen, his assets seized, his reputation completely destroyed. But that wasn't my problem. When the case went to trial, Mark looked even worse than before. He sat at the defendant's table, slumped over, his once pristine suit now wrinkled and ill-fitting. He barely spoke, barely even looked at me. The arrogance was gone. He knew he had lost. The judge ruled in my favor, just as we expected. Mark was ordered to repay every dollar he had stolen, hundreds of thousands of dollars in damages, legal fees, and restitution. Money he didn't have. Which meant only one thing. Everything he owned would be liquidated. What little he had left, his car, his electronics, even the last bits of inheritance he had squirreled away, was seized and sold. And just like that, Mark was left with nothing. No money. No home. No future. But I wasn't done. Mark thought his life had hit rock bottom. He was wrong. Once the lawsuit was settled, I made sure everyone knew what he had done. See, I wasn't just interested in winning. I wanted to erase the last shred of credibility he had left. I wanted to make sure that even after he got out of prison, no one would ever trust him again. So I went public. I contacted old acquaintances, former coworkers, and mutual friends. I told them everything. The fake will. The stolen inheritance. The fraud charges. The court ruling. I even shared the bank records proving he had been stealing from our parents while they were still alive. And then I went a step further. I posted the entire legal case online. Every document. Every piece of evidence. The court's final ruling. Everything. Mark's entire history of deceit and fraud was now out in the open for anyone to see. And it worked. Within days his name was ruined beyond repair. Employers wouldn't touch him. Old friends cut ties completely. He became a cautionary tale, the man who had tried to steal everything and ended up with nothing. And as the final cherry on top, a few months after the ruling, I got a call from a very unexpected source, Mark's old landlord. Figured you might want to know, the man said. Your brother came crawling back, begging to rent his old place again. I raised an eyebrow. And? The landlord chuckled. I laughed in his face. I smirked. Good. Mark had burned every bridge. He had nowhere left to go. And for the first time in his life he had to face the consequences alone. And that was the best revenge of all. Mark had always believed he could weasel his way out of anything. No matter how deep he was in trouble, he always had a backup plan. A lie to spin, a new victim to manipulate, a way to talk himself out of consequences. But this time, there was no escape. The day of his sentencing, I sat in the courtroom watching as the judge read out his fate. 4 multiple counts of financial fraud, forgery, identity theft, and attempted grand larceny. The defendant is sentenced to 12 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole before serving at least 9. A collective gasp rippled through the room. I saw Mark flinch, his hands gripping the table in front of him like it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, probably trying to calm him down, but it was no use. 12 years. A full decade in a cell. For the first time in his life, Mark had finally lost everything. And yet, he still had the audacity to turn to me, his face twisted with desperation. You did this to me, he hissed under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. I just smiled. No, Mark. You did this to yourself. The bailiffs moved in, cuffing him and leading him toward the exit. He struggled for a second, like he thought he could argue his way out of it, but when the reality finally set in, his shoulders slumped, and he let them take him away. As he passed by where I sat, he turned his head slightly, his eyes filled with something I had never seen before, real fear. And just like that he was gone. Mark thought prison would be a temporary setback. He probably imagined he'd get out early, find a new scam, and rebuild his life. But the reality was much harsher than his delusions. A few months after his sentencing, I got a letter from him. It was the first time he had reached out since that day in court. I almost threw it away, but curiosity got the best of me. Dear brother, I know you hate me. I know I screwed up. But you have to understand, I never meant for things to go this far. I was desperate. I needed help. I thought you'd understand. I can't survive in here. These people, they know what I did. They don't respect fraudsters. They see me as weak. I need you to help me. Please. If you could just loan me some money for my appeal. If you could just talk to the lawyers, maybe I could get out sooner. I swear I'll pay you back. Just, don't leave me here. Mark, I folded the letter, set it on my desk, and then, without a second thought, I threw it in the trash. Mark had spent his entire life treating everyone around him like disposable resources, using people and then discarding them when they were no longer useful. Now he was the one being discarded. And I felt absolutely nothing. Mark's time in prison wasn't easy. He had spent years thinking he was better than everyone, but now, he was just another inmate, a fraudster, a conman, and worst of all, a joke. I got occasional updates from old acquaintances who still kept tabs on him. Week 1, he mouthed off to the wrong people and ended up with a broken nose. Month 3, he tried to scam some of the tougher inmates, thinking he could talk his way into favors. It backfired horribly. Year 2, he begged for early release, citing mental distress. The judge laughed him out of the hearing. By year 5, no one even remembered his name. But for me, life had never been better. With Mark gone, I was finally free. For years, I had carried the weight of his betrayals, his lies, his manipulation, the constant fear of what he would try next. But now, that weight was gone. I spent my retirement traveling, investing in passion projects, and reconnecting with family members who had also suffered under Mark's selfishness. At one point, I even bought back the old family home, the same one Mark had tried to steal from me. I restored it, honored our parents' memory, made it into something real. And when people asked me about Mark, I just shrugged. He made his choices, I'd say, and now he's living with them. Because in the end, the best revenge wasn't just taking everything from him. It was proving that I never needed him in the first place. And he was nothing without me.